Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are really tackling something significant. We're going deep into the architecture of, well, human identity itself and the potential for, real lasting transformation. Our framework for this exploration comes from the incredibly detailed research in The Foundations of Angel Wing, Volume 1. This is pretty dense stuff, psychologically and philosophically speaking, but it gives us a really meticulous way to understand how the self works. Before we really jump in, though, I do want to take a moment. We need to acknowledge the foundational work here. It's immense. This deep dive, it really stands on the shoulders of insights from Dr. Shatana Kripalu, who is the founder and CEO of the Angel Wing LLC, and also Dr. Elizabeth Berman, a member of Angel Wing's mastermind group and a dedicated presenter. And of course, Sachin Karnik, the researcher who did all the crucial background work for the Foundations of Angel Wing Volume 1 technical book. So a huge thank you for providing such rich material for us to dig into.
Absolutely. It's quite something to get into this specific work. Our mission today really is to unpack that critical link between memory and emotion. It's often invisible. We'll look at how they actually work together to build the perceived self, the person you think you are, and then we'll trace the path that's laid out in the material towards self-mastery and that profound, irreversible transformation that's proposed.
Okay, so let's start right there at the foundation. Memory. The material doesn't just see it as like a hard drive, right? It's presented as the actual psychological bedrock of our whole identity.
That's exactly the key point. Memory isn't passive. It's not just recording. It's actively building. The mind uses memory to construct what the material calls the coherent narrative. You can think of it like a personal documentary film that's constantly being edited, looped, connecting the I was, the I am, and the I will be.
Right.
And this story, this narrative, built up over time, it successfully gives us this really powerful feeling, this almost universally accepted illusion, actually, of a stable self, a self that just continues, unchanging through time.
But that word illusion is doing a lot of work there because if we're basing our identity solely on memory, we're using a record that's, well, incomplete and biased, isn't it? Why does the material stress that selectivity?
Because the criteria for selection are almost entirely emotional, not factual. Memory filters reality, shakes it based on what feels significant emotionally, what's psychologically relevant. Your mind is basically trying to save space, and prioritize survival. If something happens that doesn't have much emotional charge, just a normal commute, say the mind tends to just let it fade pretty quickly. The memories that really stick, the ones that last, are the ones with those strong emotional tags attached.
So if I have like 364 days of just quiet, steady progress, and then one day of just massive public failure, that failure is going to be remembered way more vividly. It'll stick around longer.
Precisely. And this is where the material gets into the fascinating neurobiology behind it. It explains why certain memories get cemented in place like that. When we experience a really strong emotion, intense fear, excitement, maybe overwhelming joy, the amygdala, which is the brain region handling emotion and survival stuff, it gets highly activated.
Okay, right. The emotion center kicks into high gear.
Yes, and that intense activity directly influences the hippocampus. The hippocampus is responsible for encoding memories, moving them from short-term to long-term storage. So when the amygdala lights up like that, it floods the system with adrenaline and other neurochemicals, basically telling the hippocampus, pay attention, record this one, this is important. It's like the brain yelling, warning, life lesson here.
Okay. But this survival mechanism, this prioritization system in the brain, it has a real downside for how we see ourselves, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The major consequence is the creation of what the material calls a profound memory-based bias. It highlights how just one single intensely emotional event, maybe something painful or traumatic from childhood, like being publicly shamed or betrayed, can be stored with so much weight, so much intensity, that it effectively overshadows, just cancels out thousands of other neutral or even positive experiences that came later.
So psychologically speaking, that one bad memory is just shouting louder than maybe a whole lifetime of competence or good experiences?
Exactly that. Imagine a really successful executive, someone who's closed hundreds of huge deals, navigated complex situations for years, but then decades later, maybe they face a minor setback at work, and suddenly they feel that same visceral shame they felt as a 10-year-old kid who got an answer wrong in class and everyone laughed. That one memory, stored with traumatic intensity, is still dictating feelings of inadequacy right now, in the present, even when all the current evidence points to success. Their self-perception gets skewed distorted towards suffering, towards feeling inadequate, simply because of how the brain initially tagged that memory. And that's really the first big psychological hurdle the material points out. The self we believe we are is largely this emotionally skewed highlight reel of the past.
Okay, so we've got this skewed foundation built on biased memory. Now, the material talks about what happens when we start to actually live from that skewed foundation. This is the idea of emotional identification. How does that trap us, this linguistic fusion?
Yeah, emotional identification is really the mechanism of the trap itself. It's this phenomenon where a feeling that keeps coming back gets mistaken for who you fundamentally are,
Yeah.
an intrinsic quality. The material calls it a cognitive and linguistic fusion because, well, our language kind of betrays us here. We shift, often unconsciously, from saying something accurate like, I am feeling anxiety right now.
Which acknowledges it's temporary, yeah.
Right? It's a visitor in your consciousness. We shift from that to saying, I am an anxious person.
Ah, okay. It turns a temporary state into a permanent label, like I'm experiencing grief, suddenly becomes I am broken, or I'm reacting with irritation becomes I'm just an irritable person.
That's the core of the problem right there. These fleeting internal states, moods, anxieties, specific reactions, they harden, they become fixed self-definitions. So the individual stops really experiencing life as this dynamic, flowing field of awareness, and instead they become sort of a repository of emotional residues, like
Yeah.
a mental junk drawer, just full of old feelings and reactions that were never really processed or let go of.
That sounds exhausting. And it leads straight into the next really powerful concept in the material. Living as a historical echo. If I'm defining myself by how I felt 10 years ago, I'm not really here now, am I?
You're absolutely not present. When that identification process is complete, the person is essentially living from the inertia of memory. They're just continuously replaying those old emotional imprints. The actual present moment, which might be quiet or neutral or even beautiful, gets ignored. It's just used as a kind of stage to reenact the old emotional dramas.
Can you give us a sort of concrete example? How does this echo play out day to day?
Sure, let's say someone grew up in a family where their opinions were constantly dismissed. So they developed this core emotional imprint of feeling insignificant. Now, fast forward. They're an adult in a work meeting. A colleague politely interrupts them, maybe just to ask a clarifying question. Objectively, it's a normal professional interaction. But that historical echo kicks in, and it screams internally, see, you're being silenced again. You don't matter. The emotional reaction that follows, maybe sudden anger, defensiveness, withdrawing it, isn't actually a response to the colleague at all.
It's the old tape playing.
It's a faithful replay of the childhood feeling. The past is dictating the present reaction, locking the person into this narrative defined by old wounds, old reactions.
It's like self-sabotage on loop. And the material explains why it keeps going, right? Through this idea of the mutually reinforcing cycle, the memory-emotion feedback loop.
Yeah, this feedback loop is what keeps the whole trap going. It ensures that emotional identity stays active, stays alive. It works in two main ways. First, emotion gives memory meaning. Like we said, events without that emotional tag just don't seem significant. They fade.
Right.
But second, and this is crucial, memory gives emotion continuity. Just the act of remembering a past emotional event like that humiliation or feeling silenced, it actually recreates the feeling of shame or anger right here, right now in the present.
So consciously, my brain might know, okay, that happened 10 years ago. But my body, my nervous system is currently getting that cortisol hit from the original event just because I thought about it.
Exactly. The recollection literally reactivates the emotional energy. And that confirms the illusion. See, I am still broken or I am still unworthy. This sustained emotional energy reinforces the belief in that rigid historical identity, which in turn makes the mind prioritize memories that seem to validate that emotional belief. It's a closed loop.
Wow.
It locks the person into reactivity. And until awareness consciously steps in and interrupts that loop, they're stuck in a self-image, dictated entirely by past reactions. It's a perfect self-sustaining system of suffering, really.
Okay, so we've laid out the trap pretty clearly. How do we start taking it apart? The material suggests the first real step towards self-mastery is this rigorous self-inquiry, asking hard questions about the self.
This is where we start to, poke holes in that coherent narrative we talked about. The initial exploration the material proposes really forces you, the learner, to question the usual anchors of identity. Like, is your identity really defined by your name, your job title, how much money you make, your role in your family, the number of friends you have?
All the external stuff.
Exactly. The goal is to start realizing that all these labels, while maybe useful for navigating society, are ultimately external. They're temporary. They aren't the core of who you are.
And that moment when you realize your identity might be something deeper than your career or your relationship status, that's where the power starts to shift back, isn't it?
That realization is the first real taste of sovereignty. Yeah.
But the path isn't straightforward. It's got obstacles. One of the biggest ones, according to the material, is that our erroneous identifications, these mistaken beliefs about who we are, often come directly from how others treated us. External validation or invalidation, especially in the past.
Right.
Our parents, our peers, society, we confuse their judgments or circumstances about us with our intrinsic worth.
And then there's that other big hurdle mentioned, this sort of unspoken belief that life should be fair or rational. Ah, yes, the personal yardstick of success. This is huge. We carry around this expectation, often totally unconscious, of how a good, successful, or moral life is supposed to look. Then when reality inevitably deviates, bad things happen to good people, or our success doesn't match our mental picture, we feel deep distress, deep discontentment.
We take it personally.
We personalize universal aspects of life. We think the randomness of misfortune is somehow targeted, punishing us for some deep flaw. Getting past that distress means recognizing life isn't always rational or fair by our standards. Accepting that is actually crucial for emotional stability.
So if the ultimate goal is liberation from these mental shackles, where should we focus our attention?
Well, the starting point has to be acknowledging our own ignorance. The ignorance of believing that historical echo is actually us, and from there cultivating awareness. This means learning to just observe the workings of our own mind, the unique patterns, but without judging them, just watching the show.
And this leads to what feels like the absolute core revelation in this whole framework, something often misunderstood. The mind is not the self.
That distinction is absolutely paramount. Your mind is a part, a tool, a brilliant processor, sure, but it is not the sum total of who you are. When you truly grasp that you are the integrated whole, the awareness behind the thoughts, you instantly become less dependent on what others think. That constant need for praise or validation just fades. It starts to fade. Because your sense of stability becomes internal, not based on external factors.
Okay.
When your awareness can transcend the mind and its endless stories, you can remain in this liberated state, unburdened by all the old thoughts, desires, memories that used to define you.
So that's the ultimate objective then, this identity shift. The material calls it true awakening and liberation.
Right. True awakening is described as the point where your relationship with your emotions completely flips. Awareness recognizes that emotions are just events within consciousness, like weather patterns passing through the sky. They aren't the sky itself. The identity shifts entirely. It goes from I am my feelings to I am that boundless space within which feelings happen. And that insight, that shift in perspective, is what reclaims your freedom, because the witnessing awareness stays steady even if the emotional weather gets stormy. You're no longer defined by the history of your reactions.
That shift sounds amazing, moving from being reactive to being this liberated awareness. But it's not just a mental concept, right? The material really details the physical cost of living in that historical echo through the intricate mind-body interplay.
Oh, absolutely. The connection is unavoidable, and modern science backs this up completely. The material explains how many chronic physical problems can actually be traced back to a mind that's constantly stressed or imbalanced. It happens through this cascade effect, neurophysiology, hormones being released. When the mind perceives distress may be triggered by that historical echo of shame we talked about, it activates the primal fight-or-flight stress response.
And the body takes the hit. We get the rapid heart rate, the shallow breathing, maybe digestive issues, muscle tension, all that physical stuff.
Exactly. And this is where we tend to fall into what the material calls the symptom trap. We often only become really conscious of this mind-body link when the physical symptoms get loud enough, chronic chest pain, maybe anxiety-triggered muscle aches, constant headaches.
Right. Then we pay attention.
But we focus exclusively on trying to suppress or get rid of the physical symptom, maybe with medication or by avoiding situations. We totally neglect the underlying mental trigger that's constantly firing. It's like treating the fever but ignoring the infection causing it.
And often, this mental trigger, this activity, it's running in the background subconsciously. The material talks about this deep-seated stuff as unconscious programming and reflexes. How deep do these reflexes actually go?
They are profoundly deep. The materials suggest they can start developing potentially right from conception, shaped by our earliest environment, even the emotional states of people around us back then. They become deeply conditioned automatic reflexes, just like instinctively pulling your hand away from a hot stove.
Yeah.
You don't think about it, it just happens. So when a trigger appears in our life, even a small one, these old programs kick in automatically, leading to those conditioned, often undesirable reactions. Maybe chronic fatigue, feeling drained, emotional outbursts, panic attacks.
So it's like our subconscious mind is playing this old, invisible mental film, a reaction loop, every single time a trigger shows up. And it keeps the whole negative cycle going without us even realizing it sometimes.
That mental film analogy is pretty good, yeah. It holds the person hostage to the past. The solution, according to the material, lies in continuous, sustained practice using self-mastery tools and deconditioning. Transcending the mind isn't a one-off event. It takes deliberate, ongoing effort, often through practices like meditation, specific self-inquiry techniques, ways to create distance from the mind's constant chatter, and cultivate that stable, observant state instead.
Now, you mentioned tools. The material specifically refers to the angel wing practice tools for this deconditioning work. We obviously don't need the proprietary details, but can you explain the concept behind what these tools aim to do?
Certainly. Conceptually, the material describes these tools not as quick fixes, but as rigorous, sustained daily practices. They're designed to actively help rewire those deep-seated neural pathways associated with the old programming. They generally involve things like specific forms of focused meditation, targeted cognitive exercises designed to interrupt that emotional identification process we talked about, and self-observation methods to help you become aware of the subconscious programs before they turn into a full-blown physical or emotional reaction. Regular use is key to shifting your baseline state from automatic anxiety towards intentional peace.
And it's that regular use that creates what the material calls the critical window, right? That moment that can save us from just reacting blindly.
That window is absolutely vital. Yes, consistent practice gives the individual just a few precious seconds, sometimes just a moment between the trigger and the usual reaction. In that moment, you can breathe, you can observe what's happening internally, and you can consciously choose to engage the prefrontal cortex.
The thinking part of the brain.
Exactly. The most evolved part, responsible for knowledge, decision-making, wisdom, impulse control. Engaging it lets you bypass those deeply ingrained short-loop reactions run by the older, more reactive parts of the brain. It allows for a conscious response instead of an automatic reaction.
Okay, so the ultimate goal here is described as immovability. I have to admit, that word sounds a bit daunting, maybe even unrealistic. In the heat of an argument or a crisis, how possible is it really to stay immovable and engage the prefrontal cortex? Isn't that asking us to be almost inhuman or maybe emotionally shut down?
That's a really important question and a common misunderstanding. The material is very clear. Immovability doesn't mean emotional numbness or detachment. Not at all. It means emotional stability. It requires taking absolute personal responsibility for your internal state, no matter what's happening externally. It means realizing that the trigger, the annoying person, the traffic jam, the thing someone said, is actually just a reflection. It's asking you, why does this specific thing still push my buttons? Why does it trigger such a big reaction in me?
Ah, so the focus shifts inward.
Entirely. It's reflecting your internal programming, not necessarily saying something true about the external world. You are always 100% responsible for your response. You're not responsible for the trigger itself, but your reaction to it is yours alone.
That completely reframes conflict then. It moves away from defending yourself to understanding yourself. And the material makes a distinction between a healthy response and those unhealthy reactions in conflict situations.
Yes, it identifies the two common unhealthy fight-or-flight reactions. There's the active aggression, yelling, escalating, getting highly agitated, and then there's the freezing response, going into shock, total inaction, feeling paralyzed internally. Self-mastery allows for a response instead, one that's rooted in understanding, maybe patience, definitely tranquility. By maintaining a stable, calm tone and presence, even when someone else is agitated, you actually create a different kind of environment.
You change the energy.
You do. Your stability can influence the situation, potentially even helping the other person access their prefrontal cortex, rather than just escalating the conflict. It shifts the dynamic from chaos towards potential clarity.
Okay, moving beyond individual mastery, the material points towards the ultimate goal, this permanent shift in identity. It draws a really clear line between simple change, which can be temporary, reversible, and transformation.
Yes, transformation is defined very specifically as permanent and irreversible. The material uses that powerful analogy. A caterpillar changes into a butterfly. It's a true metamorphosis, a breaking away from an old form, an illusion. Once transformed, there's no desire to go back to the previous, often turbulent state. It results in this state of deep tranquility, profound stability. The self maintains a balanced, steady state internally. The individual learns to see everything pleasure, pain, success, failure as essentially equal events passing through consciousness. This prevents getting excessively attached to the good stuff or completely devastated by the bad stuff.
And to maintain this elevated state, the material keeps coming back to the constant practice of mindfulness.
Mindfulness is presented as the absolute foundation, the key. It's the continuous practice of breaking that cycle of unexamined automatic thoughts we keep talking about. It's what enables you to successfully manage emotions and consistently engage that prefrontal cortex, the wise part of the brain. By actively cultivating consciousness, we learn to let go of the constant pull of the historical past and the anxieties about the imagined future. We start to recognize that the present moment, if you just observe it without all the mental commentary, is often actually quite serene. It holds infinite creative potential.
I thought the inclusion of the Taoist concept of Wu Wei was really interesting here too. How does that fit in?
Yeah, Wu Wei, often translated as non-doing or maybe effortless action, fits perfectly within this framework. It's about moving with the flow of life, like water. Water doesn't fight a big rock in its path, right? It goes around it or over it or sometimes over eons. It gently wears it down. Practicing Wu Wei means overcoming obstacles not through brute force or resistance, but through intelligence, flexibility, adaptation. It allows creativity and intuitive action to emerge instead of rigid reactive patterns.
So once this level of personal transformation starts to become more solid, the perspective naturally seems to widen out towards realizing our interconnectedness, this
Yeah,
idea that we are fundamentally energy beings.
exactly. This is the realization that moves beyond the limitations of the personal ego structure. The material posits that we are all at our core, part of a larger energy mass. You could call it soul, spirit, a shared field of consciousness. The language varies. But the underlying principle, even from a scientific view, is that energy doesn't die, it just transforms. And that fundamental reality links every single living thing.
So underneath all the surface differences that divide us, politics, religion, skin color, money, gender, what's the core shared reality according to this?
The material really stresses that beneath all that surface stuff, we share the exact same fundamental human systems: a nervous system, a brain, sensory apparatus. We experience the world through similar mechanisms. And beyond that, there's a shared core spirit or energy. When this fundamental unity is truly felt, truly realized, the ego's constant need to divide, compare, and create hierarchy just starts to dissolve. Harming someone else begins to register internally, almost like harming yourself. This realization naturally breeds genuine collaboration and a sense of unconditional compassion.
And finally, the material brings this all the way out to the potential for societal transformation, stating quite plainly that the state of the world is just a reflection of the collective state of all the individuals in it.
It makes sense, right? If the individuals making up a society are largely living from that historical echo, driven by fear, scarcity, and mistaken identity, then the society itself is going to reflect that instability, that disharmony. The material points out that many current systems often seem to promote division, zero-sum competition, exploitation. It gives examples like how traditional capitalism can create vast gaps between rich and poor, or how certain industries might prioritize profit over collective well-being, using the historical practices of a company like Monsanto as an illustration of that potential conflict.
And just to be clear, the material seems to use these examples not to make a specific political point, but to illustrate how systemic problems can arise when a society operates primarily from a mindset of lack and self-preservation rather than unity and shared well-being.
Precisely. The critique is rooted in observing how systems, when largely governed by unmastered minds operating from fear or greed, tend to create hierarchical belief systems, where wealth defines worth, leading to widespread stress and instability. The desired outcome proposed is a society that mirrors the stability and consistency achieved through individual self-mastery, one that fosters collaboration, real equality, mutual respect, moving beyond just narrow self-preservation towards ensuring the genuine advancement and well-being of the entire human race. The idea is that the constancy you find inside becomes the blueprint for harmony outside. Hashtag outro. So we've really covered a lot of ground today, executing a pretty thorough deep dive into these complex foundations. We started by looking closely at how memory, biased by emotion and neurobiology, constructs that fragile past-based identity. Then we navigated through the trap's emotional identification, living as that historical echo. And finally, we charted the path toward mastery, awareness, deconditioning tools, and ultimately realizing our deep interconnectedness as energy beings.
And the significance of actually pursuing this path of self-mastery, as laid out here, feels immense. It's about moving out of that reactive chaos and into intentional living. It allows us to, as the material suggests, harness the mind's incredible creative potential wisely. It really feels like a blueprint, not just for freeing ourselves individually, but for potentially evolving the whole human experience collectively. It's about sculpting our future without being constantly dragged back by the mental chains of the past. That distinction the framework makes between mere change and true transformation. That's maybe the most provocative takeaway. Transformation is presented as a one-way street, irreversible, like the butterfly can't go back to being a caterpillar. So we'll leave you, the listener, with this final thought to mull over. If that true awakened self is defined by tranquility, stability, and peace, what kind of daily vigilance, what sustained, maybe even tiny micro effort is required within your own critical window to ensure that the powerful gravitational pull of your historical echo doesn't creep back in and threaten the permanence of that hard-won true identity? Think about the sustained daily practice needed, not just to become the butterfly, but perhaps more importantly, to simply remain the butterfly.